Hello and welcome to another video. In today's video we're going to talk about the CFA qualification, which is one of the most well-respected qualifications in the world of finance. In today's video is going to be the second of two videos talking about the pros, the cons and some of the myths you might have heard. And this is from someone who's sat all three levels of the CFA qualification and works in the world of private equity. And if you want to understand more about the CFA, then go and check out my last video which explains exactly what the CFA is. What do you need to do to become a CFA charter holder, how much it will cost and how much time you'll have to spend on each of the exams. So in this video we're just going to talk about the pros, the cons and some of the myths that you might have heard about the CFA. And as someone who's actually sat the CFA exams and works in the world of finance, then I've seen firsthand how the CFA charter holder can really benefit, or maybe it hinders your career. Now let's look at some of the pros. First of all, becoming a CFA charter holder is impressive. There's no way around it. If you're spending a minimum of 300 hours for each exam and you've passed all three of them on top of working your job in the world of finance, then it is incredibly impressive. And people in the world of finance, especially private equity, investment management, asset management and hedge funds, all understand this. And on average, it takes people between 4 and 5 years to gain the CFA qualifications. So it is hard and it does take a serious amount of time. And when your boss sees that you have the CFA qualification, your boss knows instantly that you're a hard worker, which is exactly what every boss wants. It's also the highest credential that you can get in the world of investment analysis and is really high regarded in the world of finance. Only 167,000 people worldwide since the CFA started have ever gained the CFA qualification. Now that isn't actually that many people, which just shows how hard it is and how impressive it is. It's a best-in-class qualification, and if you are working in the world of finance, why wouldn't you want to get the best-in-class qualification? And that's one way to really give you an edge, especially when you go to job interviews and you're comparing against people who have similar experience. Now another thing that's great about the CFA is it's internationally recognized. Those 167,000 charter holders are spread across the world, which is great because many people haven't gone to Ivy League universities or gone to the likes of Oxford. And if you're going to move between countries, it can be really hard to try and explain to someone that whilst your university was great, it wasn't quite an Oxbridge or Ivy League. And whilst your subject at a university was one of the best in the country, then they just might not have heard of it. Whereas if you have a CFA designation on your CV, that person knows instantly that you've worked hard and you know your stuff about finance. And it's also relatively affordable. Now, just to sit the CFA exams, it costs between $2,500 and $8,000, which is between $2,000 and £7,500. That is assuming that you pass every level first time. That is just entrance to the exam and the CFA Institute's own materials, which, believe me, can be incredibly dry and difficult to understand. It doesn't actually include any other further materials from providers such as Kaplan, Schweizer and Wiley, which I'll link in the description below. But those guys are incredibly useful as they just boil down the information and make it a lot easier to understand. And they give you great exam prep. Whilst these courses can cost anything in excess of £2,000 or $2,500, which can soon add up, then you have to just compare that to other professional qualifications. If you just compare the cost of an MBA to a CFA, an MBA can cost you in excess of $100,000. Now I know comparing a CFA to an MBA isn't a fair comparison because they are different qualifications, but as a postgraduate qualification, which you can study for whilst you're working, the cost is significantly less to do a CFA than it would be if you were to do an MBA. But that's something just to consider. And if you do want to understand more about the differences between each of the professional qualifications, let me know in the comment section below and I'll do some other videos comparing the CFA to other professional qualifications. And let's not forget, the whole reason you're sitting a professional qualification in the world of finance is to hopefully gain a little bit more knowledge. I know the vast majority of people just want the letters after their name, but along the way, you'll probably get an understanding of the financial world. Because the CFA is so broad and you're covering 10 topics at each exam, from the likes of fixed income, equity investment, alternatives and ethics, you're going to get a pretty broad picture of the world of finance. This will give you a great understanding of all the different divisions in a bank or in an asset management firm so that you can understand what each division does and you can bring it all together. And that gives you a great edge when you're working on deals. And I know that personally from working on a number of private equity deals when you have to pull together different terms from debt, derivative markets, equity markets, and pull these all together to invest in different assets. So it can be incredibly useful. Now that all sounds good, and you can understand why people take this CFA. But there are a number of downsides. The biggest downside is the big time commitment. The CFA exams aren't easy, and it's recommended that you take a minimum of 300 hours of study for each exam. And normally that's spread over 4 to 6 months. And all of this is on top of your day job. And if you work in the world of finance, you're probably working pretty long hours as it is, which means that you're going to have to study early in the morning before you start work, after work if you can, and take up your entire weekends just studying for this exam. And if you just think that the average person takes between 4 to 5 years to pass all 3 levels of the CFA, that's a major time commitment, which means that you won't be able to spend a lot of time socializing or doing hobbies which you enjoy. And that's something that you really have to consider. Do you really want to spend so much time on a qualification? And does it mean that much that you'll give up your life outside of work to study for this exam? Now, one downside of the CFA, which is less talked about, is opportunity cost. And I've seen firsthand the laser focus that people have when they're studying for the exams. They just want to do the exams and then they want to finish it, get the qualification and move on with their career. However, spending a minimum of 900 hours over 3, 4, 5 years to study for this qualification means that you're giving up a lot. You're giving up your free time outside of work, but you're also giving up a lot in your professional work. If you're spending every waking moment studying, you're not necessarily building your network, you're not doing extra work, and maybe sometimes your boss is actually protecting you, knowing that you're studying for this exam, that they don't want to put too much on you, which means that whilst you'll be studying for a qualification, you might not be working quite as hard on your job as someone who's doing exactly the same role. Now there's a trade-off here. Do you want the qualification or do you want to progress in your role? And that's something you have to consider before you're doing your CFA. And one thing you have to remember as well with the CFA, it won't instantly help you with your day job. The CFA is so broad. It covers topics such as equity investment, fixed income, derivatives, ethics, financial reporting and accounting. And not every single one of those topics will help you in your job. I know that firsthand. I work in the private equity industry. Now, private equity is a topic within the alternative investment section of the CFA exam. The alternative investment section of the CFA exams only accounts for between 5 and 10% of each exam. So private equity is a small part of the exam. So as you can see, there probably isn't going to be a huge amount of crossover directly from the CFA private equity section into my day job. Now, I know that private equity does cross a vast majority of different sections such as equity investment, fixed income, derivatives, and financial reporting. It didn't directly help my day-to-day job so that I knew way more about exactly what I was doing each and every day. The only way in which I can gain more experience from that is just by doing my job. So there's some of the downsides of taking the CFA exams. Now, before we go into talking about my opinion on whether you should take the CFA exam, we're just going to talk about some of the myths that you probably have heard from people who have taken the CFA exam or have been explaining to you about the CFA. The first one is it'll get you into the world of finance. If you work in a job which is completely separate and far removed from the world of finance, the CFA won't really help. It's not your golden ticket. Just because you've got a CFA does set you apart from other people who are applying, but if those other people have got years of experience in investment banking or hedge funds, and you've got some experience in something completely different, the CFA won't really help. You really need to show that you're interested in the world of finance, as there's a number of people who are queuing up to work at banks. And just by having a CFA and no other experience or no other interest isn't really going to help. And similar to this, it won't necessarily further your career. Just as I mentioned, one of the cons is spending so much time and focusing on your CFA whilst other people are building their network and doing more projects. Just by gaining those 3 letters after your name will not mean that you're a better person at your job. It'll mean that you've worked really hard and gained a great qualification, but specifically at your job, you might not be better than other people. It doesn't mean that you have the right to be promoted over someone else, and it doesn't mean that you have the right to earn more money. Just remember, if you're stagnant in your job and you're thinking of doing the CFA to go to the next level, there might be other issues that you need to address before you spend 900 hours on a professional qualification which might not help you. And this is always a big one, and people always love to tell you that they've passed the CFA exam first time. For someone who's sat all 3 levels but failed my CFA level 3 and not a charter holder, I wish that I had passed all 3 first time. However, only 9% of all people who are CFA charter holders have passed the CFA first time, which means that less than 16,000 charter holders manage that feat. But as you and I know, the finance industry isn't run by those 16,000 people. Some of the best people in finance don't have the CFA, and just because you spent a few more years or maybe failed a few times doesn't mean that you're worse at your job than someone who passed first time. And also, something you always have to remember in these situations is that people come from different backgrounds and people's companies treat them different when they're studying for their CFA. I know when I was studying for my CFA, there were other people in the classroom whose companies sponsored them to do the qualification. It meant that the company would give them days off, maybe 1 day a week to study for the exam, and their bosses would give them less work so that they could focus on the actual exam. If you just work in mergers and acquisitions, you might be doing a lot of deals in the 4 to 6 months which you're prepping for your CFA. This means that you won't have lots of time to spend studying. And even if you try and fit it in on evenings when you're not working until 2 a.m. in the morning, or weekends when you're not expected to work, it can be incredibly difficult. And you just can't fit in the 300 hours which are required. This doesn't mean that you're worse at your job, and it doesn't mean that the person who passed their CFA is better at finance or your job than you. It just means that they've probably had more time to prepare than you have. So everyone's situation is different, and just because someone has said that they passed their CFA exam on the first attempt doesn't necessarily mean that they're better than someone else who has had to pass all 3 levels at their second attempt. It just depends on the circumstances. So there you go, those are some of the pros, some of the cons, and some of the myths of the CFA. But is it worth it? Well, overall, I'd say yes. If you're a young person who wants to get into the world of finance, I'd recommend the CFA. I know that I haven't passed all 3 levels, but I've sat all 3. And that knowledge that I've gained from each of the exams has furthered my financial education immeasurably. And one thing that I would say is it has helped me get jobs, and it has really differentiated myself from other candidates. It's become a talking point at interviews, and people understand that it is difficult, even just gaining a few levels of the CFA. But one thing that I would warn against is that if you're not really interested in the world of finance and you just think that the CFA will get you a high paying job, then it probably isn't for you. Spending 900 hours for a qualification which you just want a high paying job is going to be incredibly torturous. And if you're not interested in the slightest, it'll be even harder. Maybe you should find something which is a little bit different, as this isn't going to be a golden ticket to a wonderful career. So there you go. That's the pros, the cons, and myths, and my opinion on the CFA. If you have any questions about the CFA, or you want to see a comparison of the CFA to other professional qualifications, let me know in the comment section below. And if you have enjoyed today's video, please hit that like button. And if you want to see more videos like this from a finance professional who works in the private equity industry, then hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you next time.